When we imagine ancient civilizations, we often picture grand temples, powerful kings, massive battles, and legendary heroes. But there's one thing history books rarely focus on: what people actually ate every day. Not the royal feasts painted in artwork, not the exaggerated banquets of emperors, but the real food that sustained humanity centuries ago. And when you peel back the layers of time, the truth is far more surprising, far stranger, and sometimes far more unsettling than you might expect. Ancient food wasn't just about survival. It shaped cultures, defined social classes, fueled wars, and even determined who lived and who died. Long before supermarkets, refrigeration, or modern hygiene, people relied on whatever the land, sea, or animals around them could provide. Sometimes that meant rich, flavorful meals. Other times it meant eating things we would never consider food today. Let's begin thousands of years ago in ancient Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization. This region, located between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, gave birth to some of the earliest cities on Earth. Agriculture flourished here. Surprisingly, bread was already a staple. But this wasn't the soft, fluffy bread we enjoy today. Ancient Mesopotamian bread was dense, coarse, and often filled with grit from stone-ground flour. Sometimes it even contained sand or small stones that slowly wore down people's teeth over time. Beer was just as important as bread. In fact, beer was safer to drink than water. Mesopotamian beer was thick, cloudy, and filled with floating grains. People didn't sip it casually. They drank it through long straws to avoid swallowing the solids. Workers were often paid in beer rations, and children drank diluted versions. Alcohol wasn't a luxury. It was a daily necessity. Meat, however, was rare for ordinary people. Most families relied on onions, lentils, barley, dates, and garlic. Garlic wasn't just for flavor. It was believed to provide strength and ward off illness. The rich enjoyed lamb, goat, and occasionally beef, but even they didn't eat meat daily. Spices were limited, and salt was so valuable it could be traded like gold. Moving west to ancient Egypt, food took on deep religious and cultural meaning. The Nile River provided fertile land, allowing Egyptians to grow wheat and barley in abundance. Bread and beer again dominated daily meals, but Egyptian bread was even more varied, with dozens of known shapes and recipes. Some loaves were sweetened with honey or dates, while others were baked with herbs. However, ancient Egyptian kitchens were far from clean. Bread often contained insect parts, dirt, and stone fragments from grinding tools. Archaeologists have discovered mummies with severely worn-down teeth, caused by years of chewing gritty bread. Fish was one of the most common protein sources. The Nile teemed with fish, and they were eaten fresh, dried, salted, or fermented. Some fish were considered sacred and forbidden to eat, while others were a dietary staple for the poor. Meat like beef and pork was rare and usually reserved for the wealthy or special occasions. Perhaps most shocking is how common spoiled food was. Without refrigeration, Egyptians preserved food through drying and salting, but not all bacteria could be stopped. Food poisoning was common, and life expectancy suffered as a result. Still, the Egyptians believed food carried spiritual power, and offerings of bread, beer, and meat were placed in tombs to sustain the dead in the afterlife. Now let's travel east to ancient China, where food philosophy became deeply tied to health and balance. Thousands of years ago, Chinese diets were based on grains like millet and rice, depending on the region. Wheat arrived later and was initially considered inferior. Meat was scarce for commoners, so meals focused on vegetables, beans, and fermented foods. Soybeans became revolutionary. They were turned into soy sauce, tofu, and fermented pastes long before these foods reached the rest of the world. Fermentation wasn't just a technique, it was a necessity. It preserved food, improved flavor, and made nutrients easier to absorb. Surprisingly, dairy was almost non-existent. Milk and cheese were associated with northern nomadic tribes and often viewed as barbaric. Instead, protein came from fish, insects, and occasionally pork or poultry. Insects, especially silkworm pupae, were eaten as a regular food source in some regions, a practice that continues in parts of Asia today. Salt was heavily controlled by the state. Governments realized that whoever controlled salt controlled the people. Taxes on salt funded armies and infrastructure, making it one of the most politically powerful foods in history. Now let's move to ancient Greece, where food reflected philosophy and social class. Despite modern images of lavish Greek feasts, most ancient Greeks lived on a simple diet. Bread, olives, figs, cheese, and wine made up the core of daily meals. Meat was rare and usually tied to religious sacrifices. When animals were sacrificed to the gods, the edible portions were shared among the community. Wine was always diluted with water.
Ow.
Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric and dangerous.
Ow.
Even so, alcoholism was common. Greeks believed wine revealed truth and encouraged deep thought, which made it central to philosophical gatherings known as symposia. Spices were limited, but herbs like oregano and thyme were common. Fish was more accessible than meat, especially in coastal regions. However, fresh fish was expensive inland, creating a clear divide between the wealthy and the poor. Ancient Greek athletes followed strict diets. Some consumed massive amounts of bread and cheese, while others ate meat exclusively, believing it increased strength. There was no consensus on nutrition, only belief and tradition. The Roman Empire took ancient food excess to an entirely new level. While poor Romans survived on bread and porridge, the wealthy indulged in some of the most bizarre meals in history. One of the most famous Roman foods was garum, fermented fish sauce made by leaving fish guts in the sun until they liquefied. The smell was so strong it could fill entire neighborhoods, yet Romans loved it and poured it over nearly everything. Roman banquets were designed to show power, not taste. Exotic animals like peacocks, flamingos, dormice, and even giraffes were served to impress guests. Dormice were fattened in special jars and rolled in honey and poppy seeds. While the idea sounds absurd today, it was considered elite cuisine at the time. For ordinary Romans, life was much harsher. Bread was the backbone of survival, and when grain shipments failed, riots erupted. The famous phrase "bread and circuses" wasn't symbolic, it was literal. Keep people fed and entertained, or risk rebellion. Now let's explore ancient diets outside Europe and the Middle East, in the Americas. Long before European contact, indigenous civilizations thrived on sophisticated food systems. The Maya, Aztecs, and Inca relied heavily on maize beans, squash, a combination that provided complete nutrition and sustained entire empires. Chocolate, originally a bitter spicy drink made from cacao beans, was sacred. It was consumed by elites and warriors, often mixed with chili peppers. Sugar was unknown, and chocolate was never sweet. To ancient civilizations, chocolate was power in liquid form. The Aztecs also practiced ritual cannibalism, though not in the way popular myths suggest. Consuming small portions of sacrificed warriors was believed to transfer strength and divine energy. This was ceremonial, rare, and deeply spiritual, not a daily source of food. In the Andes, the Inca developed freeze-drying techniques thousands of years before modern science. Potatoes were left outside at night to freeze, then dried in the sun, creating chunoa lightweight. Long-lasting food that could be stored for years and used to feed armies and survive famine. Medieval Europe had its own shocking food realities. Contrary to popular belief, spices were not used to hide rotten meat. Spices were far too expensive for that. Instead, the poor often had no choice but to eat food that was already turning bad. Bread quality depended on wealth. White bread was reserved for the rich, while the poor ate dark, dense bread made from rye, barley, whatever grains were available. During severe famines, bread could include grass, sawdust, or crushed bones, just to stretch supplies. Peasants rarely ate meat, surviving mostly on pottage, thick stew made from vegetables, grains, and scraps. Nobles, on the other hand, consumed enormous amounts of meat, often heavily salted. Ironically, fresh fruits and vegetables were sometimes avoided by elites, who believed they caused illness. Water was unsafe to drink, so beer and ale were consumed daily, even by children. Medieval ale was weak in alcohol, but rich in calories. It wasn't just a drink, it was food. Perhaps the most surprising truth is how little ancient diets resembled modern ones. Sugar was rare, fruits were smaller and less sweet. Vegetables were tougher. Flavors were stronger, earthier, and often bitter. Food was seasonal, unpredictable, and sometimes deadly. Yet, despite all this, ancient diets created resilient societies. People learned to adapt to scarcity, preserve food without technology, and extract nutrition from almost anything: grains, insects, blood, organs, and fermented plants. Today we romanticize the past, imagining simpler and healthier lives. But ancient eating was not clean, easy, or safe. It was brutal, ingenious, and deeply connected to religion, power, and survival. The next time you sit down to a modern meal, remember this: your ancestors survived on grit-filled bread, fermented fish guts, bitter herbs, and whatever they could find. And without their strange, resourceful diets, civilization itself might never have survived.